In this video, I want to go a little bit deeper into the attribution settings in the data views interface in Customer Journey Analytics. Now, here we are kind of halfway through creating a new data view, and we've selected some visit settings, and we've selected which components we want in the data view, etc. And really the last thing to do here is to set these attribution settings for any of these components that we want to. And so really that's the first thing to know, is that you don't have to set attribution settings for your dimensions or metrics. But I want to talk about what happens if you do and what happens if you don't. So you'll see obviously we have dimensions and metrics listed here as our components, and we can choose a dimension or a metric and set these settings. So if I choose a dimension, I can do a couple of things. I can, first of all, change the name to a different name if I want to for that component. But really, we're talking about these attribution settings. So I select an attribution model. You can see there's an info bubble here about it. You can learn more by clicking on that link, etc. But I can select any of these attribution models that are in this dropdown. And if you are familiar with Attribution IQ in Adobe Analytics, then you are already familiar with these. If not, then go ahead and find out about these, look in the documentation and look at what these different attribution models mean. But you can see here we can do last touch and first touch and linear and participation and J-shaped and all these kinds of good things here. But let's say that we decide to do a last touch. So in other words, all of the credit goes to the most recent or the last value that was placed in that dimension. And then of course we can choose our expiration. So you can choose the person or the reporting window for the person, or we can choose a custom time or just a session, for example. So if I choose custom time, then you can see here that I can go to a certain number of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, etc. So whichever one I want, whether I want that done at a visitor or person level, if I want it at a visit or session level, or if I want a custom time period, I have a lot of flexibility in creating when this should expire. So this is really very similar to the expiration and the attribution that you would have set into an EVAR in Adobe Analytics in the admin console with the addition of these additional attribution models. Now, I will also mention that if you do not set the attribution settings for a dimension, then it will basically treat it as it would have a prop in Adobe Analytics, or in other words, it just lasts for one hit, typically one page view, and then that's it. But if you do want it to persist, and any dimension can persist for a certain time period, then you can set this expiration. So think of that as looking forward, right? This gets set, and it's how long in the future do you want it to stick around, and that's the expiration. So for example, instead of year, it's a little bit of a goofy one to select for that, but let's say tracking code, which is typically a campaign variable that you'll set so you know what they clicked on to come to your site. And let's say that we're going to do the last touch, so the most recent one that they clicked on to come to your site gets all the credit, and we're going to have that expire, let's say a week. So I'm going to go custom time, and I'm going to go to 1 week. Okay. And that's basically how you set that for the different dimensions. Now let's talk about metrics, because metrics work a little bit differently. Now, if you have a metric that does not contain attribution settings, okay, so for example, let's just go with orders, and there are currently no attribution settings. So in that case, and actually let me deselect tracking code for a minute. When you select orders here and there is nothing selected for attribution settings, then it will default back to the attribution settings for the dimension. So whatever dimensions that you're applying those orders to, it will use those dimensions attribution settings. However, you may want to set attribution settings for a metric. and to say, you know what, no matter what happens, I only want the look back window to be this long. So in this case, let's say it is an order, and we're going to use, again, the last touch. But in this case, we're just going to say the session. We only want it to apply to the session. So in this case, when an order is placed, it will only give credit to the dimensions that were set during that session. Anything before that will not get credit. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about the tracking code? I set that one to a week, right? I set that one to a week right over here. And I set orders just now to the session. There's a conflict. What about when there's an order? How long do I look back for a tracking code? Or from the tracking code perspective, how long do I keep that around and apply it to an order? That really kind of means the same thing. And the answer to that is that the attribution settings for the metrics override the attribution settings for the tracking code. So in this case, even though the tracking code was set, let's say 2 days ago, and is still hanging around to see what conversions happen, if it's an order, it's not going to be attributed back to the tracking code because it was 2 days ago, and orders is only looking back for a session. And again, orders settings will override the tracking code settings because the metric settings override the dimension settings. So I hope that helps you as you go through the creation of your data view to be able to set up the attribution settings for your dimensions and metrics. Good luck.